She married her step-grandfather and took over a multi-million-dollar church. For years, the whispers were just rumors. But now, Mary Cosby's sister has come forward with allegations that could change everything we thought we knew. Happy New Year, everyone! And what a way to start the year, because while most of us were recovering from our New Year's celebrations, watching fireworks light up the Charleston sky on King Street, ringing in fresh starts and new beginnings, HBO dropped a documentary that's shaking the reality television world to its core. The Cults of a Real Housewife, featuring Mary Cosby. And let me tell you, the details that are coming out are absolutely wild. Now, before we dive deep into this rabbit hole, I need to tell you something important about my involvement in this documentary. I was one of the people interviewed, and here's what most people don't understand about how these things work. When you walk into that soundproof room, you have a scheduled call time. You sit down in front of those cameras, and you have absolutely no idea what anyone else is saying. You're completely in the dark about the other conversations happening in other rooms on other days with other people. So when I sat down to watch this documentary, I was watching it with the same fresh eyes you have right now. I had no clue what was about to unfold. But there's another reason my perspective on this is unique. I was probably one of the last people to see Mary Cosby's mother and stepfather before everything that happened. That visit, that experience, it gave me a window into a world that most people never get to see. And now, with this documentary out, with Mary's own sister breaking her silence, all of those pieces are starting to fit together in ways that are honestly disturbing. So let's talk about what's been revealed. Let's talk about Denise Jefferson. Denise is Mary Cosby's sister, and in this HBO documentary, she's speaking out publicly for the first time about what she witnessed. The allegations she's making aren't small. They're not petty family drama. Denise is accusing her own sister of displaying really strange, concerning behavior with Robert Cosby Sr. And if you're not familiar with who Robert Cosby Sr. is, let me explain, because this is where things get complicated. Robert Cosby Sr. was Mary's step-grandfather. Yes, you heard that right. Her step-grandfather, the man who married her grandmother, Rosemary Cosby, the woman everyone called Mama Cosby. Rosemary was the founder of Faith Temple Pentecostal Church, a massive religious institution that became the foundation of the entire Cosby family legacy. When Mama Cosby died in 1997, she left behind not just a church, but an empire. Power, influence, wealth, followers, all of it tied up in this religious organization that she'd built from the ground up. And after her death, something happened that nobody saw coming. Mary, the granddaughter, eventually married Robert Sr., the widower, the step-grandfather. And with that marriage, Mary became the church's first lady, stepping into a position of authority that many believed should never have been hers. Now, we've known about this unconventional marriage for years. Mary herself has been open about it on Real Housewives of Salt Lake City. She's talked about it, she's defended it, she's explained it as her grandmother's dying wish, as something God ordained. But what Denise is revealing in this documentary goes deeper than just the marriage itself. She's talking about what led up to it, the behavior, the dynamics, the manipulation. According to Denise, there was already internal conflict within the church over Mary's role and her behavior long before Mama Cosby died. In fact, Denise claims that Mama Cosby actually disfellowshipped Mary from the church, kicked her out. Her own grandmother removed her from the congregation because of concerns about her conduct. Think about that for a second. A grandmother, the founder of a church, making the decision to remove her own granddaughter from that church. That's not a small decision. That's not a moment of anger. That's a deliberate act that suggests something serious was happening. But then Mama Cosby passed away. And according to what's being alleged in the documentary, Robert Cosby Sr. brought Mary back into the church. The very person who had been disfellowshipped was suddenly reinstated, and not just reinstated as a regular member, but elevated to a position of leadership, eventually becoming the first lady of the entire organization. So how did that happen? How does someone go from being kicked out by the founder to marrying the founder's widower and taking over the whole operation? That's the question at the heart of this documentary. And the answers that are emerging are deeply unsettling. Let's talk about Robert Cosby Sr.'s role in all of this, because according to the documentary, this man positioned himself as being compelled by God to marry Mary. He allegedly told church leaders that he was receiving divine signs, that God himself was directing him to marry his late wife's granddaughter. And he didn't just keep this to himself. Robert Sr. went around to the leaders of Faith Temple, bringing them into private meetings, sitting them down, and explaining to them that he had spoken to God, that he was getting signs, that Rosemary, Mama Cosby herself, wanted him to marry Mary. Not her daughter, her granddaughter, a woman who was young enough to be his daughter, a woman who at the time was already married to someone else. And here's where the timeline gets really important, because the speed at which things happened raises so many questions. Mary divorced her first husband, Dana Harris, in September of 1998. Just 1 year after Mama Cosby's death, and then just weeks later she married Robert Sr. Weeks, not months, not years, weeks. Mary was about 25 years old. Robert Sr. was about 45, a 20-year age gap, a step-grandfather and a step-granddaughter, and a marriage that happened so fast that it left people's heads spinning. Now, Mary has always maintained that she married Robert Sr. because of her grandmother's wishes and because of God's guidance. She's told that story consistently, but that account has been disputed by multiple family members, and now, with this documentary, those disputes are being laid out in detail with sources, with fact-checking, with legal verification. I want to pause here and talk about something really important, because there's a journalist who worked on this documentary, and she addressed the credibility of what's being presented. She made it clear that this wasn't just people saying whatever came into their minds. Everything had to be fact-checked, legally checked, double-sourced. People said things during the filming process that didn't make it into the final cut because they couldn't be verified. This wasn't a hit piece. This wasn't tabloid gossip. This was journalism with ethics and standards. And that matters because it means that what you're seeing in this documentary, what you're hearing from these family members, it's not just wild speculation. It's their alleged perspective, backed up by a rigorous verification process. And let me tell you something about my own involvement. When I sat down for my interview, I didn't speak from a perspective of making factual claims about Mary's church or the inner workings of Faith Temple. I spoke from my personal experience. I talked about what it was like to go into the home of Mary's parents, what I saw, what I felt, how I ended up being connected to this story in the first place, because nobody from Salt Lake City called me up and asked me to get involved in this world. I intertwined myself in it through my own curiosity and my own reporting, and then HBO called. And that's how I ended up in that soundproof room sharing my piece of this complicated puzzle. But let's go back to the allegations about Robert Sr., because there's more. According to the documentary, after Rosemary's death, Robert Sr. didn't just assume spiritual leadership of the church. He became deeply involved in Mary's personal life in ways that went beyond pastoral care or family support. Denise alleges that Robert Sr. used his position and his claimed divine calling to consolidate power and wealth, and one of the examples given is that he purchased Mary a BMW, a luxury car, given at a time when their relationship was shifting from family connection to something else entirely. Think about the optics of that. A step-grandfather buying his step-granddaughter an expensive car right around the time he's telling church leaders that God wants them to be married. It's not illegal, but it raises questions about influence, about grooming, about the ways power can be wielded in religious communities where questioning leadership is seen as questioning God himself. Now, I need to mention something else. This isn't the first time these allegations have surfaced. If you've been following my content for a while, you might remember that I did an interview with Dan Cosby about 3 or 4 years ago, and Dan said all of this back then. He talked about the strange dynamics. He talked about Robert Sr.'s manipulation tactics. He talked about the way the marriage happened and the way the church power structure shifted. But at that time, it was one person's account, one family member speaking out. Now, with this HBO documentary, there are multiple voices, multiple sources, all telling similar stories, and that changes the weight of these allegations significantly. Let's talk about what it means to be disfellowshipped from a church, especially a church like Faith Temple. Disfellowship is not a casual punishment. It's a formal process of removal from a religious community. In many Pentecostal and evangelical traditions, it's reserved for serious moral failings or doctrinal disputes. It's meant to protect the congregation and theoretically to encourage the person being removed to repent and change their behavior. The fact that Mama Cosby, the founder, the matriarch, the spiritual mother of this entire community, made the decision to disfellowship her own granddaughter suggests that whatever was happening was serious enough to warrant that level of action. And then after Mama Cosby's death, that decision was reversed. Mary was brought back in, not quietly, not as a regular member sitting in the back pews. She was brought back and elevated to the highest position of female leadership in the church. That reversal, that elevation, it had to be authorized by someone with significant power. And according to the documentary, that someone was Robert Sr. So we have to ask, was this about faith? Was this about family, or was this about control? Because here's the thing about religious communities, especially tight-knit ones like Faith Temple. The leader doesn't just have spiritual authority. They have social authority, financial authority, emotional authority. When a leader says that God told them something, questioning that claim becomes incredibly difficult for believers. You're not just questioning a person's judgment, you're potentially questioning God's will. And that creates an environment where manipulation can thrive, where inappropriate relationships can be justified, where power can be consolidated without meaningful accountability. Mary has defended herself by saying that she followed her grandmother's wishes, that Mama Cosby wanted her to marry Robert Sr., that it was part of a plan to keep the church in the family to preserve the legacy. But multiple family members, including Denise, dispute that version of events. They say that Mama Cosby never wanted that marriage, that she in fact had concerns about Mary's relationship with Robert Sr. even before her death, that the disfellowship was evidence of those concerns. So who's telling the truth? That's the question viewers are left grappling with. And honestly, it's a question that may never have a definitive answer because the one person who could settle it, Mama Cosby herself, is gone. What we're left with are competing narratives, family members on different sides, and a documentary that's trying to piece together what really happened based on the testimony of those who were there. Now, I want to address something that might be on your mind. This all sounds bizarre, right? A granddaughter marrying her step-grandfather. A church leader claiming God told him to marry someone decades younger. A family fractured over power and inheritance. It sounds like something out of a fictional drama. And yet, this is real life. These are real people, real families, real pain. And while it's easy to watch this from a distance and shake our heads at how strange it all is, we have to remember that for the people involved, this is their lived reality. This is their trauma. This is their story. And that's why I think this documentary is so important. Not because it's salacious, not because it gives us something to gossip about, but because it's shining a light on dynamics that exist in many religious communities but rarely get talked about publicly. The ways that power can be abused under the cover of faith, the ways that family loyalty can be weaponized, the ways that women in particular can be controlled and manipulated by men in positions of spiritual authority. Mary Cosby has been a polarizing figure since she first appeared on Real Housewives of Salt Lake City. Some people found her fascinating, others found her off-putting, but regardless of how you felt about her as a reality TV personality, this documentary asks us to look deeper, to consider what might have been happening behind the scenes, to think about the ways that her story intersects with larger questions about power, faith, and family. And here's something else to consider. Mary has access to resources that most people in her situation wouldn't have. She has a platform. She has wealth. She has the ability to tell her side of the story to millions of people. But what about the other members of Faith Temple? What about the people who have been part of that church for decades, who trusted the leadership, who gave their time and money and faith to an institution that may not have been what it seemed? What's their experience been? How have they been affected by all of this? Those are questions that the documentary begins to explore, but there's so much more beneath the surface. When I visited Mary's parents, when I sat in their home and heard their stories and saw their lives up close, I got a glimpse of the complexity of this family. There was love there. There was also pain. There were loyalties and betrayals, secrets and revelations. And walking away from that experience, I knew that whatever the public saw of Mary Cosby on television was only a fraction of the whole picture. This documentary is peeling back more layers, but even now, I suspect we're still only seeing part of the truth. Denise Jefferson's decision to speak out could not have been easy. Going public against your own sister, especially when that sister has power and influence and a public platform, takes courage or desperation or both. And the fact that she was willing to do it, that she was willing to put her name and face to these allegations, suggests that she believes the truth needs to be told, regardless of the personal cost. But let's also be fair here. We're hearing one side of the story in this documentary. Mary Cosby has not been silent. She's pushed back against these allegations in the past. She's maintained that her marriage to Robert Sr. was legitimate, consensual, and spiritually ordained. She said that the people criticizing her don't understand her faith, her family, or her grandmother's wishes, and she's entitled to that defense. We live in a world where allegations are not the same as proof, where someone's perspective is not the same as objective truth. What this documentary does, though, is present enough evidence, enough testimony, enough documentation to make a compelling case that something was deeply wrong in the way events unfolded after Mama Cosby's death. It's not asking you to convict anyone in the court of public opinion. It's asking you to pay attention, to question, to think critically about what happens when faith and power and money all get tangled up together. And here's something I find particularly striking. The phrase "signs from God" keeps coming up in the documentary. Robert Sr. allegedly used that phrase repeatedly when explaining why he needed to marry Mary. He told church leaders he was getting signs, divine messages, spiritual confirmations, and in a religious context, that kind of language carries enormous weight. How do you argue with someone who claims to be speaking for God? How do you push back against a spiritual authority who says they're following divine orders? You can't, not easily, not without risking your own standing in the community, not without being labeled as faithless or disobedient or worse. And that's exactly the kind of environment where abuse can flourish. Because when authority figures cloak their desires in religious language, they make it almost impossible for others to challenge them without feeling like they're challenging God Himself. This dynamic isn't unique to Faith Temple. It exists in religious communities around the world, across denominations, across faith traditions. The specifics of Mary and Robert's story are unusual, yes, but the underlying pattern, the way spiritual authority can be weaponized to serve personal agendas, that's disturbingly common, and that's why this documentary matters beyond just the specifics of one family's drama. Now let's talk about the journalistic process for a second, because I think it's important to understand how documentaries like this get made. When you're dealing with allegations this serious, you can't just throw them on screen and hope for the best. There are legal teams involved, fact checkers, multiple rounds of verification. Every claim has to be substantiated, every source has to be vetted, and anything that can't be proven to a reasonable standard doesn't make it into the final cut. The journalist who worked on this project made it clear that people said things during their interviews that didn't end up in the documentary because they couldn't be verified. That's responsible journalism. That's how you distinguish between credible reporting and tabloid speculation. And it means that what you're seeing in this documentary has gone through a rigorous process of verification. These aren't just wild accusations. These are allegations that have been checked, double-checked, and deemed credible enough to present to the public. But even with all that verification, the documentary is careful to frame these as alleged perspectives. These are the stories that family members and former church members are telling. This is what they believe happened. And that's an important distinction because it acknowledges that in situations like this, absolute certainty is often impossible. All we can do is listen to the testimony, look at the evidence, and draw our own conclusions. For me personally, my role in this documentary was straightforward. I shared my experience of visiting Mary's parents. I talked about how I got connected to this story through my own reporting and curiosity. I described what it was like to be in their home, to hear their perspectives, to see the family dynamics up close. I wasn't there to make grand claims about the church or to accuse anyone of anything. I was there to share what I witnessed and what I learned from that experience. And now, watching the full documentary, seeing how my testimony fits into the larger narrative, it's surreal. Because I'm realizing that my visit happened at a critical moment, that I was witnessing the aftermath of events that are only now being fully understood. So where does this leave us? What are we supposed to do with all of this information? Mary Cosby's story has been public for years, but this documentary is bringing new details, new voices, new perspectives to light. For some people, it will confirm suspicions they've had all along. For others, it will be shocking and disturbing. And for Mary herself, this has to be incredibly difficult. Regardless of what the truth is, having your family air grievances publicly, having your marriage scrutinized, having your faith questioned, that takes a toll. But here's what I believe. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. When there are allegations of abuse, manipulation, or misconduct, especially in religious contexts, those allegations need to be heard. The people making them need to be taken seriously, and the institutions involved need to be held accountable. That doesn't mean rushing to judgment. It doesn't mean assuming guilt without evidence. But it does mean listening, investigating, and being willing to acknowledge when something has gone terribly wrong. Faith Temple Pentecostal Church is still operating. Mary Cosby is still in a position of leadership there. And the members of that congregation deserve to know the truth about their church's history and their leaders' behavior. They deserve to make informed decisions about where they place their faith, their time, and their resources. This documentary is a step toward giving them that information. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you watched the documentary yet? What did you think? Were you surprised by Denise's allegations? Do you believe Mary's version of events? Or do you think there's more to the story than she's willing to admit? And what do you think Mary Cosby is feeling right now, watching her family's private pain become public entertainment? Because let's be real, that's what this is for, many viewers, entertainment. We watch these documentaries, we discuss them, we dissect them, and then we move on to the next scandal. But for the people involved, this is their life, this is their family, this is their trauma. And while I think it's important that these stories get told, I also think we have a responsibility to engage with them thoughtfully, compassionately, recognizing that behind every shocking headline is a human being dealing with very real consequences. Mary Cosby married her step-grandfather and took over a multi-million-dollar church. For years, people whispered. For years, people wondered. And now, her sister has broken her silence. The allegations are serious, the evidence is compelling, and the questions are far from answered. But one thing is clear, this story is far from over. The documentary is just the beginning. The conversations it's sparking, the investigations it might inspire, the healing or further pain it might bring to this family, all of that is still unfolding. So if you haven't watched The Cult of a Real Housewife yet, this is your weekend. Put your feet up, grab some popcorn, and prepare to have your mind blown. And then come back here and tell me what you think. Because this is the kind of story that demands conversation, that demands reflection, that demands we ask ourselves hard questions about faith, power, family, and truth. Happy New Year, everyone, and what a way to kick off 2026. For Mary Cosby, this documentary is probably a nightmare. But for the rest of us, it's a reminder that the truth, no matter how complicated or uncomfortable, always has a way of coming